At 5:42 local time on the eastern approach to the Strait of Hormuz, the first sign of trouble did not rise from the horizon. It appeared on a screen. Inside the Combat Information Center of the lead U.S. escort, the air search display was already busy with the usual early morning picture, routine traffic patterns, patrol routes, and familiar regional surveillance tracks. Then a new cluster appeared high to the southwest. The returns were large, evenly spaced, and moving at a steady speed. Too precise to be civilian, too significant to dismiss. The watch supervisor leaned in closer. For 2 seconds, no one spoke. Then the identification team went to work, their voices short and mechanical as they called it out. Multiple heavy airborne contacts, high altitude, stable formation, heading toward the Hormuz corridor. Up on the bridge, the sea still looked calm. Gray morning light spread across the water. Merchant ships stayed in their lanes. Off the port bow, an Iranian patrol vessel continued shadowing the American formation from a careful distance, remaining just outside the point that would trigger an immediate response. From the outside, nothing seemed different. Inside CIC, everything had changed. The data link filled first, followed by the voice circuit. Farther out, an E-2D Hawkeye confirmed what the screens were already suggesting. These tracks were not random. They were part of a coordinated package, moving with support, timing, and discipline. Moments later, the classification became firm. B-52 bombers. No one in the room showed a reaction. None was necessary. The meaning was instantly clear. The bombers were still high, still far away, still flying well outside any reckless profile. But their presence immediately changed the geometry of the strait. Every coastal radar would see them. Every patrol commander in the area would be forced to recalculate. A corridor that had felt tense only minutes earlier was now operating under the shadow of strategic air power. The tactical action officer gave the next order in a calm, level voice. Raise posture. Hold present course. Track all Iranian surface movement. The destroyer did not turn, and that mattered. There was no dramatic maneuver, no blaring alarm, no visible rush on deck. That was exactly the point. The American formation pressed forward at the steady, controlled pace of a force that had anticipated this moment before it arrived. On the surface picture, 2 U.S. escorts maintained their spacing around the central transit lane, while optical systems turned toward the nearest Iranian contacts. At 5:47, the Iranian patrol vessel to the north increased speed. It was not a direct rush, not yet. But its bow wake sharpened, and its track shifted just enough to reveal intent. On another display, 3 smaller fast boats closer to shore broke away from a loose cluster and began moving southeast, angling for a better view of the American ships and the airspace above them. Bridge watchstanders reported the movement. CIC logged it. Electronic support teams recorded a rise in emissions from the coast. Iranian radar activity was building in layers now, one site after another, as though the shoreline itself were waking up. Overhead, the bomber package continued inbound. Then the operators noticed something else. Trailing behind the B-52s, farther back and not yet central to the tactical picture, were additional returns. Larger than fighters, slower than escorts, flying in disciplined intervals. At first, they looked like distant support traffic buried inside the wider air package. Then the spacing repeated. Then it repeated again. The air controller narrowed the filter and stared at the display. Additional heavy tracks behind the primary group. The supervisor turned. Type? Unknown. Transport profile. Multiple aircraft. That changed the room. Bombers alone could signal pressure. Bombers with supporting transports suggested planning, sequence, and follow-through. Out on the bridge wing, binoculars remained fixed on the sea, because in Hormuz, that is usually where danger first becomes visible. But the real shift that morning was unfolding far above the sightline, where the air picture had become too structured to dismiss as mere theater. At 5:52, one Iranian fast boat pushed farther out than the others, cutting across the dark blue water in a hard diagonal run. Its movement was forceful enough to draw attention, but measured enough to remain technically short of provocation. The American destroyer responded the way professional crews are trained to respond, by recording everything and changing nothing that might look like uncertainty. Range calls came in, bearing updates followed. Electro-optical cameras locked on. The captain stayed on the bridge in silence, watching the boat, then the sky, then the merchant lanes ahead. Above them, the first B-52s neared the outer edge of the corridor. They were not diving, not rushing, simply arriving. At 5:57, the unidentified aircraft behind them became clearer on U.S. screens. Transport-class signatures, multiple aircraft, holding a route that lined up almost too perfectly with the open water approaches east of Hormuz. One operator spoke without looking away from the display. This is not just a bomber pass. No one answered because no one needed to. The Iranian boats were still moving. Coastal radars were still sweeping. The American ships were still holding course. But by then, the true shape of the operation had begun to reveal its deeper layer. The bombers were only the leading edge. Something else was coming behind them, and whatever it was being brought into Hormuz for a reason. At 6:04 local time, no one inside the American tactical net still saw the approaching formation as a routine flyover. The bomber tracks were already firmly established high above the corridor, wide and deliberate, holding the kind of altitude that signaled control without pushing the situation into open disorder. Below them, the surface picture remained tense but contained. Iranian patrol craft continued shadowing from offset angles. Fast boats stayed active along the outer edge of the waterline. Still, no one had crossed the threshold. Then the aircraft behind the B-52s came fully into focus. Inside CIC, the returns on the air display were now too distinct to misread. Multiple heavy transports, evenly spaced, moving along a route that had clearly been cleared and protected before their arrival. Support elements were layered around them with precise timing. Radar coverage overlapped. Communications remained brief and disciplined. The escorts above were not reacting in the moment. They were shaping a corridor. One American controller studied the display a moment longer than usual, then keyed the circuit. The air corridor is being built. The words settled over the room with unmistakable weight. The bridge received the call next. There was no visible reaction, only a subtle tightening in posture. Lookout stayed focused through their optics. The helm held steady. Engine output did not change. The destroyer's wake carved a straight white line through the morning water, while the formation moved ahead, as though this had always been the expected pattern of the day. At 6:06, the Iranian side adjusted again. A larger patrol vessel to the north reduced speed slightly, turning just enough to improve its angle toward the sky. Three fast boats to the east spread farther apart, no longer moving as a loose group. Now they were probing for approach lanes, testing the edges of American intent. From shore, emissions continued to build. Search radars, fire control support systems, command relay traffic. The coastline was no longer simply watching, it was measuring. Overhead, the U.S. Package tightened further. An MH-60 helicopter lifted from one of the escorts and climbed out over the water, nose pointed toward the eastern sector. It did not rush. It expanded the American field of view. Higher above, combat air patrol remained on station, invisible from the deck but present on every screen that mattered. The B-52s held their line above the expanding pattern like a steel ceiling. Then the first transport began to descend. Not sharply, not enough to spark panic. Just enough for everyone watching the air picture to understand that the next phase was no longer hypothetical. Inside the aircraft, that phase had already begun. Crew chiefs moved through the cargo bay. Loadmasters checked anchor lines and equipment one final time. Red light washed over helmets, harnesses, and still, focused faces. Every buckle had already been inspected. Every movement had already been rehearsed. No speech was needed. No explanation was necessary. The roar inside the fuselage swallowed everything except hand signals and muscle memory. Back over the water, Iran made its first direct attempt to disrupt the atmosphere of control. A warning transmission came across the military distress frequency, ordering unidentified aircraft to alter course and leave the area. The call was sharp, official, and clearly meant to be heard by every receiver within range. The American response was brief and procedural. No argument, no extended exchange, only concise replies from aviation controllers maintaining separation and asserting safe passage within the operating lane. The transports kept coming. At 6:09, the nearest fast boat accelerated again, this time pushing farther out from the Iranian side of the waterline. Its wake brightened in the early sunlight. Another followed. The move was aggressive enough to demand attention, but controlled enough to stop short of a direct intercept. CIC logged both tracks immediately. Surface contacts increasing speed. Maintain record. Continue air priority. That was the rhythm now. Surface threats monitored, air mission protected. At 6:10, one of the transport aircraft reached the corridor entry point. Its rear ramp opened. On the shipboard optical feed, there was little to see from that distance beyond shape and shadow. But inside the aircraft, everything changed at once. The noise deepened as the slipstream tore through the open ramp. Red light held for a final moment. Harnesses were checked again, not from doubt, but from instinct. Men rose from the side benches in sequence and moved toward the rear. Each clipped into the system. Each took the exact position assigned long before the wheels had ever left the runway. The loadmaster looked down the line, then toward the opening. Green was close. Below, the Strait of Hormuz suddenly seemed smaller. Warships, patrol craft, merchant lanes, and surveillance arcs were compressed into one narrow stretch of consequence. Iranian crews on the water could now see the American air package overhead in its full structure. Not just bombers, not just escorts, something larger, something more deliberate, a pattern that pointed toward insertion. On the destroyer's bridge, one lookout raised binoculars toward the distant formation. In CIC, no one spoke unless necessary. The room had become a machine. At 6:11, the transport crossed the release line. Inside the aircraft, the light changed. A jumpmaster turned, gave the signal, and the first line of paratroopers stepped forward into the roaring open sky above Hormuz. At 6:12 local time, over the eastern corridor of Hormuz, the first paratrooper vanished into the slipstream without the slightest hesitation. 1 second later, another followed, then another, then another. From the open rear ramp of the transport, the jump line turned into a steady mechanical flow of bodies into open air. Each man was swallowed by the wind for a brief instant before his parachute opened above the strait. Inside the cargo bay, nothing was wasted. No theatrical shouting, no panic. Only the hard, practiced rhythm of training carried out under pressure, noise, and time. Green light, step, exit, clear. Outside, the sky began to transform. What had been a clean military corridor only moments earlier was now filling with descending canopies over the water approaches east of Hormuz. White silk and darker tactical parachutes opened one after another in disciplined spacing across the morning air. Each canopy marked the exact timing of a plan that had moved from signal to execution without slowing for even a moment. From the surface, the effect was immediate. One of the Iranian fast boats that had been pressing outwards slowed first. Not because anyone had ordered it to, but because the sight above had become impossible to ignore. Another kept its speed for 2 more seconds, then edged slightly offline as its crew looked up through spray and glare at the descending formation. Even from sea level, even through distance and motion, the level of coordination was unmistakable. The shock was not in force, it was in precision. High above the drop lane, the B-52 still held altitude. Broad, dark shapes moving with calm, almost indifferent steadiness across the upper layer of the operation. They did not dive. They did not break formation. They remained what they had been from the beginning of that morning. Weight in the sky, pressure without chaos. Below them, the transports continued the insertion. Higher and farther out, fighter cover maintained its screen. On the water, U.S. escorts kept moving through the strait, while an MH-60 widened the maritime picture beneath the descending troops. Air, sea, timing. Everything was connected now. At 6:13, the first parachutes drifted lower toward the designated drop zone east of the busiest transit lanes. The wind over the water was stronger than it had appeared from altitude. Inside CIC aboard the lead escort, drift calculations began updating in real time. Controllers watched the icons shift across their overlays while radio traffic stayed tightly controlled. Every transmission was reduced to essentials: heading, speed, correction, separation. No one was talking about fear. There was too much work to do. Inside one of the American ships, the tactical action officer leaned over the display as the jump picture continued to develop. Surface contacts were still active. Iranian fast boats had not backed away. Coastal radar emissions continued rising and falling in pulses from the shoreline. Nothing about the environment was safe. That was exactly why every second of the drop mattered. At 6:14, a small complication emerged. A cluster of jumpers on the southern edge of the formation began drifting farther than planned in a stronger crosswind. Not wildly, not enough to disrupt the operation, but enough to demand an immediate adjustment. Correction calls moved through the net at once. Recovery timing shifted. One helicopter crew was reassigned to monitor the lower edge of the descent pattern. On shipboard displays, new lines were drawn, then revised again. Above the water, the paratroopers did what trained airborne forces do when conditions stop matching the textbook. They corrected under canopy, spread slightly, then reoriented toward the intended assembly area with the kind of discipline that cannot be improvised after boots have already left the aircraft. Iranian crews saw that too. From their vantage point on the water, this was not a loose spectacle and not a symbolic gesture. It was an insertion protected by layered aviation, watched by warships, and adjusted in real time without visible confusion. That was the detail that changed the atmosphere. Not simply that American paratroopers were descending over Hormuz, but that the entire structure around them remained calm while it was happening. At 6:15, one Iranian fast boat accelerated again. This time, it edged toward the outer boundary of the drop zone, as if testing for a reaction. The move was detected immediately. Optical systems locked on. Range was called. The MH-60 dropped lower and turned toward the contact, not attacking, not rushing, simply making its presence impossible to miss. A warning went out across the surface channel. Short, direct, final. The Iranian boat held its course for a few more seconds. Spray rose high from its bow. Then its angle changed. Not much. Just enough to show hesitation. The boat stayed outside the protected boundary, still moving, still watching, but no longer pressing forward with the same confidence. And that hesitation mattered, because at that exact moment, the first American paratroopers were hitting the ground. One after another, they landed across the designated surface and shoreline approaches with the hard, abrupt impact of a combat insertion. Chutes collapsed, harnesses came off. Weapons were pulled in tight. Small groups formed almost instantly, each man shifting to the next task before the last canopy had even touched down. More jumpers followed behind them. By 6:16, the main body of the drop was nearly complete. The final sticks exited in clean, disciplined sequence, while those already on the ground began consolidating into organized elements. Above them, the B-52 still held position in the wider area. Their role hadn't changed, their silence was part of the pressure. Out on the water, Iranian boats continued to maneuver at a distance, no longer pushing aggressively, no longer setting the pace. They hadn't been engaged, they hadn't taken hits, but the initiative they had been testing all morning was no longer theirs. The last parachutes opened high over the corridor, the final men descended, and with the drop nearly complete, the most dangerous phase was just beginning, the moment when everyone on the water had to decide what came next. At 6:19 local time on the eastern edge of the Strait of Hormuz, the last canopies were still collapsing on the ground when the struggle for the waterline began. Not a direct clash, not yet. A contest for distance, for nerve, for the ability to keep moving without being forced to react. Inside the drop zone, American paratroopers were already tightening into structured elements. Canopies were stripped and dragged clear. Equipment bundles were recovered. Team leaders counted personnel, checked spacing, and pushed their units into initial defensive positions with the speed of a force that had expected no pause between landing and potential contact. What mattered now wasn't the jump. It was the first 3 minutes after it. Out on the water, U.S. ships adjusted, almost imperceptibly. The lead escort maintained its axis through the corridor, bow steady, profile unchanged. A second warship widened the maritime screen by just a few degrees, enough to expand visibility and close gaps in the surface picture without signaling a dramatic shift. The MH-60 that had been covering the drop zone lowered again, tightening its pattern between the outer edge of the paratroopers and the nearest Iranian vessels. Higher above, ISR coverage stayed locked across the entire operational area. Every move had the same purpose: hold the shape, deny surprise, keep the tempo. At 6:20, the Iranian side made its most decisive move of the morning. 3 fast boats accelerated together from the northeast, forming a shallow wedge as they cut across the water toward the outer boundary of the American activity zone. Their wakes flared bright behind them in parallel lines. This wasn't random movement anymore. It was a deliberate probe, fast enough to create pressure, controlled enough to maintain ambiguity. Inside CIC, the tracks were marked instantly. 3 fast contacts, bearing 041, speed increasing. The tactical action officer didn't look up. Project line. A projected intercept arc appeared across the display, stretching toward the maritime edge nearest the drop zone. Not a direct collision course, but close enough to trigger the next level of response. On the bridge, the captain watched through binoculars for a moment, then lowered them. Warn them! The first surface warning went out over bridge-to-bridge frequency. Clear, calm, unhurried. U.S. forces are conducting military operations. Maintain safe separation. Do not enter the restricted area. No reply. The boats kept coming. At 6:21, the MH-60 shifted nose on toward the approaching wedge and dropped lower, rotor wash hammering the surface as it moved into a position that couldn't be ignored. It didn't attack, it didn't posture aggressively. It simply occupied the most important piece of airspace between the incoming boats and the men who had just landed. That single move changed the geometry. Now the Iranian crews had a helicopter directly ahead, warships off their flank, and optical systems tracking every meter of their approach. On American screens, laser range data, electro-optical feeds, and radar tracks merged into one clear, tightening situation. Range decreasing. Lead vessel marked, 2,000 yards. On the ground, the paratroopers continued working as if nothing had changed. That was the discipline. Positions were established, sectors assigned, perimeter forming. At 6:22, the lead Iranian boat ignored the first chance to break off. Its bow stayed low, its wake stayed sharp. The 2 boats behind it adjusted slightly, tightening their formation as if testing whether the Americans would move beyond warnings. The second warning went out, shorter this time, closer to final. On the bridge of the U.S. escort, no one raised their voice. The helm stayed steady. Gun crews were ready, but not displayed for effect. The destroyer moved forward through blue water with quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need to look urgent to be taken seriously. Then came the closest moment of the morning. At 6:23, the lead Iranian boat pushed just a little farther, enough to make every range call feel tighter than the last. The MH-60 dropped lower and crossed directly across its path, creating a wall of noise, spray, and unmistakable intent. At the same time, the American ship's sensors remained locked. Every camera recording, every angle covered. For 4 seconds, the boat kept coming. For 4 seconds, everything in Hormuz seemed balanced on a single decision. Then the bow lifted. throttle eased back. The lead boat slowed. There was nothing dramatic about it. No sharp turn, no visible panic, just a subtle release of pressure. The smallest possible adjustment that still changed everything. Behind it, the other two boats hesitated for half a beat, then broke formation, peeling away to port and starboard. The wedge dissolved. The push was over. Inside CIC, there was no reaction, only assessment. Lead contact slowing, trail contacts turning away, boundary holding. That was enough. By 6:24, the Iranian boats were still there, still armed, still watching, but they were no longer controlling the edge of the encounter. The Americans had drawn the line, held it, and forced the approach to stop without a single shot. On shore, the paratroopers completed their first consolidation. Accountability reports moved through the net. Outer security positions were set. What had been a vulnerable landing zone minutes earlier was now a controlled position. Over the water, the MH-60 climbed slightly and resumed its screening orbit. The escorts held formation. The B-52s, now farther from the center of events, began easing away from the most sensitive part of the corridor. But their earlier presence still hung over the operation like something no one could ignore. The most dangerous test had passed. Not because the threat disappeared, but because it had been pushed forward, measured, and stopped. That morning, Hormuz did not erupt into open conflict, but for the first time since the bombers appeared, Iranian movement had been forced to pause. At 6:31 local time, the shape of the operation was no longer in question. The B-52s continued moving out of the hottest section of the corridor, maintaining altitude as they withdrew from the immediate center. The heavy transports had already cleared the drop lane. Fighter cover remained overhead. The MH-60 kept its pattern above the waterline. On the surface, the American escorts held steady. On shore, the paratroopers who had entered the area just minutes earlier were no longer descending. They were established. That was the moment everything shifted. Not with a launch, not with impact, not with a shot across the bow. With completion. Every major phase had been carried out inside one of the most compressed and high-risk maritime corridors in the world, and it had all happened on schedule. The bombers arrived first, reshaping the air picture. The transports followed, moving through a corridor already secured above. The drop took place under observation, under pressure, and under active tracking. The waterline was tested. The line held. And by 6:31, the operation had moved from insertion to consolidation. Inside the Combat Information Center of the lead American escort, the atmosphere didn't relax. It sharpened. When the most intense moments pass in a professional operation, the work doesn't end. It becomes more precise. Surface contacts were still being tracked. Iranian boats remained scattered at a distance, no longer pushing, no longer probing in formation, but still close enough to matter. Coastal emissions continued to pulse unevenly from radar sites and command nodes ashore. Electronic surveillance teams logged every spike, every drop, every shift in pattern. The tactical picture was still crowded, but the balance had changed. American forces now controlled the tempo. On the bridge, the destroyer's captain kept scanning between the shipping lanes ahead and the sectors where the Iranian boats had fallen back. Merchant traffic still moved through the strait, a reminder that even on the edge of military confrontation, commercial life in Hormuz never truly stops. That contrast did not make the scene feel calmer. It made it sharper. Civilian vessels were passing through the same narrow stretch of water where bombers, warships, helicopters, and airborne troops had just imposed a military sequence with exact timing. At 6:33, the first full accountability report came in from the paratroopers. Primary elements assembled, outer security established, landing sequence complete. There was no extra commentary attached to the report. None was necessary. The message moved through the net with the weight of confirmation. What had entered the corridor by air had arrived intact, organized on the ground, and completed its sequence while under direct observation from Iranian forces positioned all around the area. That was the part the Iranian side had failed to disrupt. They had seen the bombers. They had tracked the transports. They had watched the parachutes open. They had pushed fast boats toward the outer edge of the operation. And still, the sequence had continued exactly as planned. At 6:35, one Iranian patrol vessel changed course again, turning broadside for several seconds before settling into a parallel shadow farther from the American formation than before. It remained present, still armed, still watching, but distance had become its own message. The closer, more aggressive testing that had defined the earlier part of the morning was gone. No one on the American side mistook that for surrender. It was something more useful than surrender. It was acceptance of reality. The MH-60 climbed slightly and widened its orbit, no longer needing to block an immediate approach lane. On the destroyers, weapons crews stayed ready. Sensors remained fixed. Voice circuits stayed disciplined. Nothing about the American posture became relaxed. but the urgency had changed shape. It was no longer about protecting the insertion from disruption. That had already been done. Now, it was about holding the result. Far above, the final trace of the B-52 presence was not sound, but structure. Even as the bombers moved farther from the corridor, their role remained stamped across the entire operation. They had not needed to strike. They had not needed to descend. Their purpose had been fulfilled the moment they forced every radar crew, every patrol commander, and every Iranian decision-maker to look up and recalculate the geometry of the strait. But by the end, it was clear the bombers were never the whole message. The real message was sequence. American air power entered first and reshaped the sky. Protected transports followed through the lane behind it. Paratroopers stepped into the wind and landed on schedule. Warships held the surface picture. A helicopter denied close approach. Iran tested the edges and found no opening. That was what happened. Not a sudden burst of chaos, not a dramatic exchange, something colder than that, something harder to answer: control. At 6:38, the tactical log aboard the lead escort showed a clean chain of recorded events. Bomber entry, corridor establishment, transport descent, jump initiation, drift correction, surface probe, warning sequence, Iranian deceleration, consolidation ashore. Time marks, bearings, speeds, distances, every minute fixed in data, every move preserved. No one on the net declared victory. Professional forces rarely do in real time. The record spoke for itself. By 6:40, the Iranian boats were still visible on radar, but only as observers at the edge of an action already completed. The American formation continued forward. The inserted troops held their ground. The corridor that had looked ready to ignite at dawn had instead been crossed, shaped, and used. And that was the final shock of the morning. Iran had prepared to watch the bombers. What entered Hormuz instead was a full American sequence, by air, by sea, and by timing. And for one long stretch of morning over the narrowest waters in the Gulf, no one could stop it.